The knock landed twice hard, measured. The kind that doesn't ask permission. I was still holding my coffee when I opened the door to Victoria Hale, standing in the pale morning chill. Clipboard pressed flat against her chest, like a shield she'd learned to wield. Her perfume was clinical, almost antiseptic, the kind worn by someone who wanted to smell like authority rather than a person. "Mr. Brewer," she said, each syllable clipped and efficient. "Violation notice number 47. Your kayak is in breach of section 12.3b. Recreational equipment is visible from the public roadway. 72 hours, $200. She let the figures hang in the cold air, watching my face the way a collector watches an insect under glass. That kayak had sat in the same spot since my grandfather placed it there the summer before he died. She knew that, and so did everyone else on this street. But her gaze had already drifted past me, scanning my gutters, my grass, my driveway cracks, and I understood then that the kayak was just the door she'd chosen to walk through. She turned before I could respond, her heels striking each porch step with the finality of a gavel, and disappeared into the fog, curling off the lake. She had no idea whose door she'd just knocked on. Tell me where you're watching from, because what happens next in this neighborhood is going to be worth every second. The knock landed twice hard, measured, the kind that doesn't ask permission. I opened the door to Victoria Hale, standing in the pale morning chill. Clipboard pressed flat against her chest, and something in her posture told me she had been looking forward to this moment. Her perfume was clinical, almost antiseptic, but her eyes carried a different temperature, warm with the pleasure of someone about to enforce a rule she personally enjoyed. "Mr. Brewer," she said, each syllable wrapped in bureaucratic formality. "Violation notice number 47. Your kayak is in breach of section 12.3b. Recreational equipment is visible from the public roadway. 72 hours. $200. She let the figures hang in the cold air, her pen hovering over the clipboard as though ready to document my reaction for future reference. That kayak had sat in the same spot since my grandfather placed it there the summer before he died. She knew that, and so did everyone on this street, but her gaze had already drifted past me, scanning my gutters, my grass, my driveway cracks, cataloging imperfections I hadn't known existed. She turned before I could respond, her heels striking each porch step with the finality of a gavel, and disappeared into the fog, curling off the lake. The coffee in my hand had gone cold. I hadn't taken a single sip. I stood in the doorway until the fog erased her. The violation notice weighed almost nothing, but my chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with money. Emily appeared behind me, her footsteps soft on the hardwood. What did she want? I handed her the paper without turning. She read it once, then again, and when she spoke, her voice had an edge I rarely heard. 72 hours. "Logan, proper procedure requires 14 days. This isn't even legal." I didn't answer. I was staring at the kayak, still resting on the rack where my grandfather had placed it. The blue hull faded now, but solid. The same vessel that had carried me across Cedar Lake on mornings when the world felt too heavy to face alone. Emily's hand found mine, her fingers cool against my palm. "We could move it," she said quietly. "Pay the fine. Let it go." Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to drag the kayak into the garage and pretend Victoria Hale had never knocked on my door. The afternoon passed slowly, the way hours do when you're avoiding a decision. I found myself in the garage without remembering the walk there, standing among sawdust and old motor oil, the familiar smell of my grandfather's world. Against the back wall sat a glass cabinet I'd been ignoring for months. Inside, a photograph of him on opening day of the MARINA, 1968, grinning beside a hand-painted sign, a tin of fishing lures he'd tied himself, and resting on faded velvet in the center, a brass anchor no bigger than my palm. I lifted it, feeling the cold weight settle into my grip. He'd pressed it into my hand the last time I saw him, his fingers trembling but his voice steady. "When you feel lost," he said, "remember where you're anchored." I turned it over, watching the light catch the tarnished surface, and caught my own reflection in the old mirror beside the cabinet. Tired eyes, tight jaw. A man was wondering if this was a fight worth having. That evening, Oliver Pratt leaned over my back fence with 2 beers, offering one like a man who recognized the look on my face. "Victoria," he said. Not a question. 6 violations in 2 years. He told me wrong shade of blue on his mailbox. Trash cans left out 40 minutes past the window. Christmas lights still up on January 2nd. "I stopped fighting," he admitted. "She has the board, the lawyers, the whole system. Nobody beats her." He nodded toward the lake, where marina lights glimmered through the trees. "Some mystery owner controls that waterfront. Victoria's obsessed with it, the only thing in this neighborhood she can't touch." I sipped my beer and said nothing. He had no idea he was standing 10 feet from the answer. After dark, I walked to the public dock at the edge of the neighborhood. The marina glowed across the water, and I could see the Eleanor in slip number 1, my grandfather's boat, her name still legible on the hull. The fog rolled in cold and thick, carrying the smell of the lake, and I stood there until my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Mr. Brewer, this is Megan Aldridge. I know what Mrs. Hale is doing, and I know who you are. We need to talk." I read it 3 times. Across the water, a boat bell chimed low and steady. Victoria Hale thought she knew who I was. She had no idea. I met Megan Aldridge at a coffee shop 2 towns over, far enough from Cedarwood that neither of us had to worry about familiar faces. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s, dark circles under her eyes, fingers wrapped around her cup like she was holding on to something that might slip away. "I was HOA secretary for 3 years, she said, before I could ask. "I quit 8 months ago, because I couldn't stomach what Victoria was turning that board into." She slid a folder across the table, and inside I found violation records organized by address and date. The same names appeared repeatedly: Oliver Pratt, Nora Griffin, Chase Dalton. Some residents had 8 violations in a single year. Others had none. "She doesn't enforce rules," Megan said. "She enforces loyalty. Cross her once, and you become a project." I asked why she'd reached out to me specifically. She hesitated, stirring her coffee slowly. 3 years ago, I was processing property tax transfers for the county. Most filings blur together, but one stood out: a trust called Cedar Lake Holdings, transferring marina assets to an individual beneficiary. The transfer amount was over $4 million, routed through a law firm in Austin. That kind of number makes you remember the name attached. She looked at me steadily. "Victoria's been hunting for that name for 2 years. She wants the waterfront for a development deal, investors, luxury condos, the whole package. If she finds out you've been living 3 blocks from her this whole time." She let the sentence hang. I drove home with Megan's folder on the passenger seat, turning over the implications. Victoria wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was executing a strategy, and I had unknowingly positioned myself directly in her path. The violations, the pressure campaigns, the selective enforcement, all of it served a larger aim. I was still processing this when I pulled into my driveway and found Richard Dane waiting on my porch. He wore a charcoal suit expensive enough to finance a small vacation, and his smile had the practiced ease of a man who billed by the hour. "Mr. Brewer, violation notice number 48. Grass height exceeds 4 inches in the northeast corner. Section 8.2A, $150. 7 days. I told him I'd mowed 3 days ago. He shrugged without breaking eye contact. "Measurements were taken this morning. The bylaws don't account for intent, only compliance." Behind him, Victoria's house glowed at the end of the street, immaculate lawn. Mercedes in the driveway, every detail curated to project control. Richard turned to leave, then paused. "Thursday's meeting will address changes to community access policies. Your attendance would be noted." The word landed like a threat, wrapped in courtesy. Thursday evening. The community center hummed with an energy I hadn't felt before, more bodies than usual, more tension beneath the small talk. Victoria sat at the head table with Richard and 2 board members whose names I'd never bothered to learn. She opened with a polished PowerPoint, Community Enhancement Initiative, Phase 1. Her proposal was elegantly disguised ambition, expanded HOA authority over adjacent zones, including the public dock and marina bordering land. "The waterfront has operated without community oversight for decades," she said. We deserve a voice in how it's managed." The room offered scattered applause. Then came the compliance report. She read violation numbers aloud, pausing just long enough on mine to let the silence do its work. "Mr. Brewer, violation 48, grass height. Status." I said I was reviewing the notice. Her smile didn't waver. "We appreciate timely resolution." It wasn't a reminder. It was a performance, a public marking of who belonged and who didn't. That night, I lay awake while Emily breathed softly beside me. I reached for my phone and opened the neighborhood social media group. A new post had appeared an hour earlier, from an account called Community Standards, a reminder that compliance reflects respect. Recently, certain residents have shown reluctance to meet basic expectations. Cedarwood thrives when everyone contributes, not when individuals place themselves above the collective. No names, no specifics, but the comments made the target clear. Some people think they're special. Maybe they'd be happier somewhere else. I scrolled through the thread, watching neighbors I'd waved to for years pile onto a version of me they'd been handed by someone else. The violations were about money. This was about erasure. Emily stirred, her eyes catching the phone's glow. "What is it?" I showed her the screen. She read in silence, then set the phone face down on the nightstand. "Logan, maybe we should sell. Find somewhere without all this." I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. Part of me wanted to agree, pack up, disappear, let Victoria have her kingdom. But my mother's voice rose from somewhere I hadn't visited in years. "I didn't raise you to run." I thought about the brass anchor in my garage, about what it would mean to abandon everything my grandfather had built. "We're not going anywhere," I said. Emily's hand found mine under the blanket. She didn't argue. Neither of us slept much after that. 2 days later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just my name typed on a plain white label. Inside was a single photocopied page, minutes from a board meeting 14 months prior. One paragraph had been highlighted in yellow. "Motion to amend CCNR section 12.3b. Quorum not present. Motion not passed." I read it 3 times. Section 12.3b. The exact clause Victoria had weaponized against my kayak. According to this document, the amendment had never been legally approved. I studied the page more carefully. The highlighting was precise, deliberate, done with a fine-tip marker, not a broad highlighter. The paper quality was heavier than standard copy stock, the kind used for official records. Whoever had sent this had access to the original board documents, and they wanted me to know exactly where to look. I folded the page and slipped it back into the envelope. Somewhere inside Victoria's system, someone was keeping score, and they had just decided to share the tally. The neighborhood felt different after that post went live. Nothing I could point to directly. No one said anything to my face, but the texture of daily life had shifted in small, unmistakable ways. Monday morning, I walked out to grab the newspaper and saw Troy Sanders across the street, loading his kids into their SUV. I lifted my hand to wave, the same gesture I'd made 100 times before. He glanced at me, then looked away, his attention suddenly consumed by adjusting a seatbelt that didn't need adjusting. The SUV pulled out without acknowledgement. I stood there holding the newspaper, feeling the cool spring air against my face, and understood that Victoria's campaign had entered a new phase. The violations were about compliance. This was about making me disappear. That afternoon, Emily came home early. I heard her car in the driveway 20 minutes before she should have been there, and when she walked through the door, her face told me something had broken. "I went to pick up my volunteer badge for the field trip," she said, her voice carefully controlled. Lauren Pierce was at the front desk. She smiled at me that particular smile and said there must have been a clerical error because my name wasn't on the approved list anymore. Emily set her purse down slowly, deliberately, like she was afraid of what her hands might do if she moved too fast. I asked if I could speak to the coordinator. Lauren said she was the coordinator now. Then she looked past me, at the other parents in line, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "We have to be so careful about who we trust with our children these days." Emily's eyes met mine, and I saw something I'd never seen there before. Humiliation. Not sadness, not frustration, The specific wound of being publicly diminished in front of people she'd known for years. They all just stood there. Logan! No one said a word. Lily was quiet at dinner, but it wasn't the contemplative quiet of a child lost in thought. It was the watchful silence of someone who had started noticing things she couldn't explain. Halfway through the meal, she looked up at me with an expression too careful for an 8-year-old. "Dad, is something bad happening?" The question caught me off guard. I asked what she meant. Sophia's mom pulled her away from me at pickup today, like she was scared of something, and some of the other kids were whispering. She pushed a piece of chicken around her plate. "Are we in trouble?" Emily's hand found mine under the table. I looked at my daughter and felt the ground shift beneath me. The isolation I could endure. The public shaming of Emily could survive. But my child learning to be afraid in her own neighborhood, that was a line I hadn't known existed until Victoria crossed it. That night, after Lily was asleep, I sat in the darkness of my living room and forced myself to think clearly. The cost of fighting Victoria was no longer abstract. Maybe the smart move was to pay the fines, keep my head down, and wait for her to find a new target. I could protect my family by surrendering. The thought lasted about 30 seconds before my grandfather's voice cut through it. As clear as if he were sitting beside me. "You don't fight for yourself. You fight so the people who come after you don't have to." I pulled out my phone and called Megan. She answered on the second ring. "The document in my mailbox," I said. "The board minutes. Was that you?" A pause. "No, I thought maybe you'd found it yourself." I described the envelope, the precise highlighting, the heavy paper stock, the way the paragraphs were formatted with justified alignment, and a footer I didn't recognize. "That footer," Megan said slowly. "Official HOA documents use centered page numbers, justified alignment with a dated footer. That's the county clerk's archival format. Whoever sent this pulled it from the county's filed copy, not the HOA's internal records." I asked what that meant. "It means someone with access to both systems is watching, and they wanted you to have proof that couldn't be dismissed as a forgery." The next evening, I drove to the marina alone. I hadn't been there in weeks, but something was pulling me back, a need to stand on ground that was unambiguously mine. Eli Turner met me at the gate, his weathered face creasing when he saw my truck. We walked the docks together, past boats rocking in their slips, the water catching the last light of day. I asked if anyone had contacted him recently. His expression shifted. "Victoria Hale called twice last week, said she represented the Cedarwood HOA, wanted to discuss partnership opportunities for waterfront access." He shook his head. "I told her the owner wasn't available. She asked who the owner was. I said that was private. She said she'd find out eventually, said it like a promise." Eli looked at me steadily. "She's not going to stop. Logan, whatever she's building toward, she thinks this marina is the key." I ended up on the deck of the Eleanor, feeling the gentle sway beneath my feet, the smell of varnished wood and lake water wrapping around me. I sat in the captain's chair and watched the marina lights flicker on, one by one. Across the lake, Cedarwood Estates glowed in the distance, the neighborhood I'd chosen because it was close to everything my grandfather had built. I'd wanted a quiet life. Victoria had made that impossible. I pulled out my phone and made the call I'd been putting off. "This is Logan Brewer. I need to schedule a consultation with an attorney. HOA law and property rights." I was still sitting on the Eleanor when the sun came up. When I finally drove home, Emily was waiting on the porch with coffee and an expression I couldn't read. "Someone's here," she said. I walked around the side of the house and stopped. Victoria Hale stood in my driveway, Richard Dane beside her, both dressed for a board meeting. But something was different this time. Richard's posture was stiffer than usual, his eyes cutting briefly toward Victoria before settling into professional neutrality, the micro-hesitation of a man following orders he hadn't fully endorsed. Victoria held a thick envelope in her manicured hands, and her smile carried the satisfaction of someone delivering a verdict. "Mr. Brewer," she said, "the HOA has completed a comprehensive compliance assessment of your property. 7 violations, 30 days to remedy. Total potential fines, $2,100, plus lien eligibility." Richard shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening for just a moment before smoothing back into blankness. I took the envelope without opening it. Victoria's smile widened, but I was watching Richard, watching the careful way he avoided my eyes. the tension in his shoulders that suggested this visit hadn't been his idea. "We look forward to your cooperation," Victoria said. She turned and walked away, heels clicking against my driveway. Richard followed a half step behind, and just before he reached the sidewalk, he glanced back at me, a look so brief I almost missed it, weighted with something that might have been a warning or might have been an apology. I stood there holding the envelope, already calculating how to turn Victoria's latest weapon against her. Sarah Calloway's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house on the outskirts of the county seat, the kind of building that looked like it had seen enough small-town disputes to have developed its own opinions about human nature. She was smaller than I'd expected, mid-40s, sharp eyes behind frameless glasses, a handshake that meant business. I'd brought everything: the violation notices, Megan's folder, the anonymous board minutes, and Victoria's compliance assessment with its $2,100 in potential fines. Sarah spread the documents across her desk like a surgeon preparing for an operation, reading each one with the kind of attention that made me feel like I was finally being taken seriously. "Before we go any further," she said, "I need to know what you want. Just making these fines disappear, or something more?" I told her I wanted to know if Victoria Hale had the legal authority to do what she was doing. Sarah nodded slowly. "That's the right question." She started with the board minutes I'd received anonymously. "This is significant. Under state HOA law, any CC&R modification requires a quorum vote with proper homeowner notice. If this amendment were never passed, every violation issued under it is technically unenforceable." She moved to the compliance assessment, running her finger down the list. "Some of these require Architectural Review Board approval before enforcement: paint colors. Structural modifications. I don't see any ARB signatures here." I asked what that meant. "It means Victoria's skipping steps. HOA boards have authority, but that authority comes with procedural requirements. Ignore the procedures, and you expose the association to liability." She paused, studying one of the documents more closely. "There's something else. This copy of the board minutes, look at the margin." She pointed to a faint notation I'd missed, a small check mark in blue ink, positioned beside the highlighted paragraph. "That's not a standard archival mark. Someone added this by hand after the document was filed. Whoever sent you this wanted to make sure you didn't miss the key passage." I spent the next morning at the county records office, a fluorescent-lit room that smelled like old paper and institutional coffee. The clerk, a patient woman named Dorothy, who seemed genuinely surprised anyone wanted to look at HOA filings, helped me pull 3 years of Cedarwood Estates documents. I sat at a plastic table for 4 hours, photographing pages and building a picture I hadn't been able to see before. The financial reports raised the first red flag. Cedarwood HOA collected approximately $180,000 annually in fees. Reported expenditures totaled around $120,000, $60,000 a year, unaccounted for. The budget included a line item labeled Community Enhancement Special Projects with a figure of $58,000, but no breakdown, no receipts, no explanation. I photographed everything and sent copies to Sarah before leaving. That evening, we gathered in Oliver Pratt's basement: me, Oliver, Megan, and Nora Griffin. The space felt appropriately clandestine: wood-paneled walls, a pool table pushed aside, the faint smell of cigars Oliver's wife had banned from upstairs. I laid out what I'd found: the procedural gaps, the financial discrepancies. Megan added the missing piece: how Victoria maintained control. "She operates by exhaustion," Megan said. "She schedules controversial votes at the end of 3-hour meetings, bundles them with routine business, and makes anyone who questions her feel like they're derailing the entire agenda." I watched board members approve things they hadn't even read, just to get home before midnight. Nora nodded grimly. I saw something worse. At my last ARB meeting before I resigned, Victoria called for a vote on an enforcement action. Beth Crandall. She's been on the board longer than anyone asked to see the supporting documentation first. Victoria stared at her for about 5 seconds without saying a word. Just stared. Beth withdrew her question and voted yes. She shook her head. "That's how it works. You don't challenge Victoria twice." The question of the anonymous source came up. None of us had sent the board minutes. "Whoever it is has access to county archives and HOA records," Megan said. That's a short list: board members, management company, maybe a county clerk. I thought about the blue check mark Sarah had spotted, placed so precisely beside the critical paragraph. Deliberate, personal. Richard Dane, I said. He's been Victoria's enforcer from the start, but something felt different last time he came to my house, like he was following orders he didn't believe in anymore. Oliver shook his head. Richard drafted half those CC&R amendments. He's a true believer. But Megan looked thoughtful. True believers can lose faith, and Victoria's been pushing harder lately, taking risks that expose the whole board. If Richard sees legal liability heading his way, she let the implication hang. None of us had proof, but someone inside Victoria's circle was keeping a different kind of record. When I got home, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. I sat across from her and told her everything: the legal vulnerabilities, the missing $60,000, the alliance forming in Oliver's basement. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. This isn't just about violations anymore, is it? I shook my head. Victoria wants control of the waterfront. The enforcement campaigns are about clearing obstacles anyone who might resist when she makes her move. Emily looked at me steadily. And you're an obstacle. I thought about the trust my grandfather had left me, the MARINA Victoria desperately wanted, the secret I'd kept for 12 years. I'm more than that, I said. I'm the obstacle she doesn't know exists. Emily reached across the table and picked up the brass anchor I'd brought from the garage. I'd been carrying it like a talisman. She turned it over in her hands, then set it between us. Then you need to be ready for what happens when she finds out. 3 days later, I received a certified letter. The board had scheduled a formal hearing regarding the shed in my backyard, a structure my grandfather had built 15 years ago, before current architectural guidelines existed. The letter cited Section 18.4, requiring ARB approval for structures over 50 square feet. My shed was 72. The hearing would determine whether I'd have to remove it or face escalating fines and lien action. But it was the signature block that caught my attention. 3 board members had signed Victoria, Richard, and Beth Crandall. Victoria's signature was bold, slashing confidently across the line. Richard's was smaller, tighter than I remembered from previous documents. And Beth's, the woman Nora had described being silenced with a stare, had signed so close to the edge of the designated space that half her last name was cut off, as if she'd been trying to make herself as small as possible. Sarah called that evening with additional news. Victoria's hired outside counsel, an attorney named Avery Lockridge. The name meant nothing to me. It should, Sarah said. Lockridge specializes in HOA enforcement. 3 years ago, she represented an association that foreclosed on a homeowner through a lien action. Victoria's not playing games anymore. She's bringing in a professional. I hung up and looked toward the window, toward the lake I couldn't quite see. Victoria had escalated to legal warfare. She still didn't know who she was fighting. But I understood now that when she found out, everything would change, and I needed to be ready for that moment. The hearing took place on a Thursday evening in the community center, the same fluorescent-lit room where Victoria had conducted her monthly performances of authority. Sarah Calloway sat beside me at a folding table, her briefcase open, documents arranged in precise stacks. Across the aisle, Victoria presided at the board table with Richard Dane on her left, and a woman I didn't recognize on her right, mid-40s. Tailored suit, the kind of composed stillness that suggested she'd done this many times before. Avery Lockridge. About 15 residents had shown up to watch, including Oliver and Nora in the back row. Victoria opened the proceedings with her usual procedural formality, but her fingers kept returning to the edge of her papers, straightening corners that didn't need straightening. She wasn't nervous exactly. She was calculating, recalibrating, like a chess player who had just noticed her opponent's bishop in an unexpected position. Avery Lockridge presented the HOA's case with surgical precision. My shed exceeded the 50-square-foot threshold in Section 18.4, she explained. No ARB approval existed in the records. Therefore, the board was within its rights to demand removal or impose escalating fines. She spoke without notes, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had won cases like this before. Sarah let the silence stretch after Avery finished, then stood. Thank you for that summary. I have a question about the timeline. She picked up a document. Section 18.4 was amended 3 years ago. Prior to that, the threshold was 100 square feet. Mr. Brewer's shed was constructed 15 years ago, when no approval was required. Can you confirm the amendment applies retroactively? Avery's expression flickered. The amendment establishes current compliance standards. Sarah nodded. Current standards. But state HOA law presumes architectural requirements apply prospectively, unless explicitly stated otherwise. I have case citations. She slid a folder toward the board. Richard picked it up, his eyes scanning the first page. Victoria didn't touch it. Her jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, not defeat, but the controlled irritation of someone who had expected a formality and received resistance instead. The hearing ended without resolution. The board voted to continue deliberations, which Sarah told me afterward meant they needed to assess their legal exposure. I walked out of the community center with Sarah beside me, the night air cool against my face after 2 hours in that fluorescent glare. That wasn't a loss, Sarah said, reading my expression. A delay isn't a defeat, but it felt like one. I'd prepared for confrontation, for resolution, for something definitive, and instead I'd received bureaucratic limbo, a vote to discuss further, a postponement dressed up as process. In the parking lot, I watched Victoria climb into her Mercedes, her posture unchanged, her confidence apparently intact. She caught my eye through the windshield and held it for a moment before pulling away. No smile, no acknowledgement, just the steady gaze of someone who believed time was on her side. But the real breakthrough came 2 days later, in Megan Aldridge's living room. I found something, she'd said on the phone, her voice tight. When I arrived, she had 2 documents on her coffee table. The first was the CC&R amendment for Section 18.4, bearing 3 board member signatures. The second was a set of signature samples from other HOA documents filed around the same time. Compare them, she said. I studied the pages, moving between them. 2 signatures didn't match, slant angles slightly off, pressure patterns inconsistent. Someone forged them, I said. Megan nodded slowly. Here's what I can't figure out. Victoria's signature is consistent across all documents. It's Beth Crandall's and Marcus Webb's signatures that don't match. Either Victoria forged their names, or someone else did it for her, maybe even without her direct knowledge. She paused. Richard Dane prepared most of these amendment documents. He had access to everything. I called Sarah immediately. She listened, then asked for photographs within the hour. If this holds up, we're beyond procedural violations. Forgery of business records is a criminal offense, potential felony territory. I asked about next steps. Document examiner to verify the signatures. That takes time. But if confirmed, we can file with the State Attorney General's office. She paused. Logan, once we go down this road, Victoria will know someone's coming. She'll fight with everything she has. I thought about Lily asking if we were in trouble, about Emily's humiliation at school. She's already fighting, I said. The difference is, now I have ammunition. The weekend brought a new escalation. Emily and I had planned to take Lily kayaking at the public dock, a small gesture of normalcy. When we arrived, a man in a yellow vest marked Cedarwood Estates Security blocked the entrance. Sorry, folks, this area is temporarily restricted. I asked on whose authority. HOA directive. There's a boundary dispute. The county's original plat shows an easement corridor that may extend HOA maintenance rights over this access point. Until the survey is completed, residents need to use alternative facilities. Behind him, the lake glittered in the morning sun. Lily tugged my hand. Dad, I thought we were going kayaking. Before I could answer, Victoria appeared along the path, dressed in weekend casual that still looked like a uniform. But her energy was different today, watchful rather than triumphant. Her smile carrying an edge of something that looked almost like wariness. Mr. Brewer, I apologize for the inconvenience. Our attorneys identified the easement ambiguity during routine title review. We're simply ensuring the association's interests are protected until the survey clarifies boundaries. I told her the dock had been public for 50 years. Historical use doesn't establish legal ownership, she said, her voice cool but clipped. I'm sure you understand these matters require proper documentation. She glanced at Lily, then back at me, and for just a moment her composure slipped. Something flickered in her eyes. Not satisfaction, but the tight focus of someone managing more variables than she'd anticipated. 3 days later, an envelope arrived from Avery Lockridge's firm. 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to a threat. Cease making defamatory statements about HOA operations, or face litigation. No specifics about which statements or which residents. Emily read it twice, her face pale. Can they actually sue us? The question hung in the air for about 5 seconds before something in me shifted. I'd spent weeks absorbing blows, retreating, second-guessing, but this letter wasn't strong. It was desperation wearing a legal costume. I picked up my phone and called the state attorney general's office. After 20 minutes of transfers, I reached an investigator named Dana Brooks in the Consumer Protection Division. I told her everything: the forged signatures, the financial discrepancies, the selective enforcement, the dock restrictions, the threatening letter. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Mr. Brewer, I'll be direct. We receive hundreds of HOA complaints annually. Most are civil disputes that belong in court. My grip tightened on the phone. But document forgery and financial misappropriation are different categories. If what you're describing can be verified, we have grounds for formal investigation. I asked what she needed. Everything, every document, every communication, every piece of evidence. I'm not promising outcomes. Investigations take time, but I'm opening a preliminary review file on Cedarwood Estates HOA. I thanked her and hung up, then sat looking at the brass anchor on my kitchen table. For weeks, Victoria had made me feel like a man defending a shrinking piece of ground. That feeling was gone now. The ground wasn't shrinking anymore. It was shifting, and Victoria didn't know she was standing on a fault line. The meeting at Nora Griffin's house drew more people than I'd expected. Word had spread through back channels, quiet conversations at mailboxes, whispered exchanges in grocery store parking lots, text messages sent from accounts that couldn't be traced to neighborhood social media. By the time I arrived, Nora's living room held 12 residents. Some I knew, and some I'd only seen in passing. Oliver and Megan were there, along with Chase Dalton, a contractor Victoria had blacklisted from HOA projects after he refused to pad invoices, Riley Monroe, a graphic designer who'd received 4 violations in 6 months for a fence she'd built with proper permits. And in the corner, looking uncomfortable but determined, sat Bethany Lee, 70 years old, resident of Cedarwood for over 2 decades, and until recently, one of Victoria's most reliable supporters. I voted for things I didn't understand, Bethany said when I asked why she'd come. Victoria made it seem like questioning her was the same as attacking the neighborhood. I believed her. I don't anymore. I laid out what we'd gathered: the forged signatures on the CC&R amendment, the $60,000 in unaccounted funds, the pattern of selective enforcement that targeted anyone who challenged Victoria's authority. Megan added the connective tissue internal emails, showing Victoria pressuring board members to approve actions without proper review, scheduling critical votes when she knew certain members would be absent, and burying controversial items in consent agendas that passed without discussion. Chase contributed something: new records of payments made to his former company for work that was never completed. Invoices Victoria had approved and signed. I thought it was a clerical error at first, he said. Now I think she was skimming, using fake or inflated contracts to move money into accounts she controlled. The room was quiet when he finished. We all understood what this meant. Victoria wasn't just abusing her authority, she was potentially committing fraud, and she'd been doing it for years. The question of what to do next sparked debate. Some wanted to go public immediately, post everything online, call the local news, force Victoria out through sheer exposure. Others were more cautious, worried about retaliation, about lawsuits, about the social cost of being seen as troublemakers. I told them about Dana Brooks and the preliminary investigation, about Sarah Calloway's assessment that we were entering criminal territory. If we move too fast, we give Victoria time to cover her tracks, I said. If we move strategically, we let the investigation build a case she can't escape. Bethany spoke up again, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was saying. There's a board meeting scheduled for next week. Victoria's planning to call a vote on expanding HOA authority over the waterfront. She wants to formalize the easement claim and establish the association as a stakeholder in any future development. She looked at me directly. She's going to push for a resolution that gives her leverage over whoever owns that marina. She doesn't know you're sitting in this room. The next morning, Troy Sanders appeared at my door. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone wrestling with a decision he'd rather not make. "Logan, I need to talk to you." He glanced around as if checking for witnesses, then stepped closer. "I know you're organizing something. People are talking. And I'm telling you, as someone who's been in this neighborhood a long time, you need to stop." I asked why. "Because Victoria has connections you don't know about. County board members who owe her favors. A brother-in-law who works in the assessor's office. People who tried to fight her before ended up losing more than just HOA battles. They lost jobs, lost contracts, got tangled in zoning disputes that took years to resolve." His voice dropped. "I'm not saying she's right. I'm saying she's dangerous. And you have a family to think about." I thanked him for the warning and watched him walk back to his house, shoulders hunched like a man who'd done what he could and knew it wasn't enough. That evening, Lily found me sitting on the back porch, staring at the lake through the trees. She sat down beside me without saying anything, her small presence warm against the cooling air. After a while, she spoke. "Dad, are you scared?" I told her the truth sometimes. She nodded, processing this. "You told me that telling the truth is always the right thing, even when it's hard." I said, remembering. "So if you're telling the truth," she said, with the devastating logic of an 8-year-old, "then you'll be okay." "Right." I put my arm around her and didn't answer, but something in my chest settled into place, a resolve that had been wavering now suddenly steady. The county board meeting was standing room only. Victoria had brought Avery Lockridge and a presentation that made her waterfront initiative sound like community stewardship rather than a land grab. She spoke about partnership opportunities and shared governance, about bringing the marina under local oversight for the benefit of all residents. She referenced the absent owner who had refused engagement, framing anonymity as negligence rather than privacy. When she finished, she called for public comment. Eli Turner stood up in the back of the room. "I represent the marina," he said, his weathered voice cutting through the murmur. "The owner is not absent. The owner has responded to every legitimate inquiry through proper legal channels. What Mrs. Hale calls refusal to engage is actually refusal to hand over private property rights to an HOA that has no legal claim to them." Victoria's composure flickered. "Mr. Turner, with respect, the community deserves to know who controls this significant asset." Eli smiled thinly. "The community doesn't have a right to that information. Property ownership is a matter of public record for those who know where to look, but it's not the HOA's business unless the owner chooses to make it so." The board chair intervened, noting that the matter required further legal review before any vote could proceed. Victoria's face remained professionally neutral, but I saw her hand tighten on her pen until her knuckles went white. After the meeting, I found myself alone with Victoria in the parking lot. She was standing by her car, watching me approach, and for the first time since that morning on my porch, she looked at me without the shield of her smile. "You think you're winning something," she said, her voice flat. "You're not. You're delaying the inevitable." I told her I didn't know what she meant. "Don't play games with me. Mr. Brewer, I know you're behind this, the complaints, the investigation, the little coalition of malcontents you've assembled. You think you're the first person to try this." She stepped closer, and I could see the calculation behind her eyes shifting into something raw. "I've spent 15 years building this community into something valuable. I've made decisions that weak people couldn't make, and I won't let some contractor with a grudge tear it down." I held her gaze. "I'm not trying to tear anything down. Mrs. Hale, I'm just asking questions. If you don't have anything to hide, the questions shouldn't bother you." Something moved across her face. Not fear, not yet, but the shadow of it. She got into her car without another word. That night, Emily and I sat on the deck of the Eleanor, watching the marina lights reflect on the black water. I told her about the confrontation, about Victoria's mask slipping, about the vote that had been postponed but not defeated. Emily listened, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This came to the house today. No return address. I unfolded it and read the typed words, Special Community Meeting Thursday, 7 p.m. Topic, Community Standards and Future Development. All residents are strongly encouraged to attend. Below it, in handwritten blue ink, 3 words, She's making her move. I recognized that blue ink, the same shade as the check mark on the anonymous board minutes. Whoever had been feeding me information from inside Victoria's circle was still watching, and they wanted me ready. I looked at Emily, then out at the water, then at the brass anchor I'd started carrying in my jacket pocket. I think it's time, I said. Emily squeezed my hand. I know. The community center had never been this full. Every folding chair was occupied, and people lined the walls 3 deep, the air thick with the particular tension that precedes something irreversible. I counted at least 70 residents, plus a reporter from the county newspaper who'd shown up after an anonymous tip Megan's work. I suspected. Victoria sat at the head table with Richard Dane and Avery Lockridge, flanking her like sentinels, her posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed the evening would end with her authority expanded rather than destroyed. I took a seat in the middle of the room, Emily beside me, the brass anchor pressing against my chest through my jacket pocket. Near the back, in a corner seat that offered a clear view of the entire room, sat a woman I recognized, but hadn't expected Dana Brooks, dressed in civilian clothes, her expression professionally neutral. She wasn't here officially, but she was here. Victoria opened with a PowerPoint presentation titled Cedarwood Community Vision, Phase 2. The slides were polished, professional renderings of a waterfront development that would transform the marina into luxury townhomes, boutique shops, a private dock accessible only to Cedarwood residents. For too long, she said, our community has been held hostage by an absent property owner who refuses to engage with local interests. Tonight, I'm asking for your support to formalize our position to establish the HOA as a stakeholder in any future development, and to pursue legal remedies if the owner continues to obstruct community progress. The applause was scattered, uncertain. I watched faces around the room, some nodding along, others exchanging uneasy glances. Bethany Lee caught my eye from across the aisle and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The pieces were in position. Questions came from the floor. Oliver asked about the financial projections, who would fund the development, and what would the HOA's liability be. Victoria deflected smoothly, mentioning private investment partners without naming names. Nora asked whether the board had obtained legal opinions on the easement claim. Avery Lockridge stepped in, citing case precedents in language designed to obscure rather than clarify. Then Chase Dalton stood up, his contractor's frame filling the aisle. Mrs. Hale, I have a question about the Community Enhancement Special Projects Fund. According to public records, that account has received approximately $58,000 annually for the past 3 years. Can you provide a breakdown of how those funds were spent? Victoria's smile tightened. All financial matters are documented in our annual reports. Chase held up a folder. I've reviewed those reports. The breakdown isn't there. Neither are receipts for several contracts that were supposedly paid from that fund, including 2 contracts with my former company for work that was never performed. The murmur that rippled through the room was the sound of a narrative beginning to crack. I stood before the noise could settle. Mrs. Hale, I have a question about the marina. Victoria's eyes found me, and I watched her reassemble her composure in real time. Mr. Brewer, I should have known you'd have something to contribute. I walked toward the front of the room, feeling Emily's gaze on my back, feeling the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. You've spent the evening talking about an absent owner who refuses to engage. You've called this person negligent, obstructive, a barrier to community progress. I reached the edge of the board table and stopped. I think it's time you met him. I turned to the back of the room, where Eli Turner stood waiting by the door, a leather briefcase in his weathered hands. He walked forward and placed the briefcase on an empty table, then withdrew a folder thick with documents. Victoria Hale has made multiple inquiries about the ownership of Cedar Marina and Cedar Lake Holdings, I said. She's been told repeatedly that the owner values privacy. What she wasn't told is why. I took the folder from Eli and opened it, removing a notarized document bearing the seal of Judge Elwood Crane. Eleanor Marina and Cedar Lake Holdings, established 1968 by Samuel James Brewer. Current sole owner and beneficiary, Logan Samuel Brewer. I set the document on the table in front of Victoria. That's me. I own the marina. I own 85% of the lake. And I own the entire shoreline that borders this community. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds before it shattered into chaos. Victoria's face had gone pale, her careful composure crumbling like a structure built on sand. "That's impossible," she said, her voice rising above the noise. "You're a contractor. You live in a—" She stopped herself, but not quickly enough. The sentence she hadn't finished hung in the air. "You live in a house like everyone else. You're nobody." I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the brass anchor, setting it on the table beside the ownership documents. My grandfather built that marina with his own hands. He taught me that real authority isn't about controlling people, it's about serving something larger than yourself. I looked at Victoria steadily. "You've spent years using this HOA as a personal weapon. You've targeted residents who questioned you. You've manipulated votes, forged signatures, and funneled community money into accounts you controlled. And you've done all of this while trying to steal property that belonged to my family before you ever set foot in this neighborhood." Victoria pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is a setup, a conspiracy. He's been planning this from the beginning." Richard Dane reached for her arm. "Victoria, stop!" But she was beyond stopping now, her voice climbing towards something that sounded like hysteria. "I built this community. I made decisions that none of you dared to make. And now you're going to let this person—" She gestured at me wildly. "I had to protect Cedarwood. I had to do whatever was necessary. You don't understand what I've sacrificed." Dana Brooks stood up in the back of the room. "Mrs. Hale," her voice cut through the noise like a blade. "I'm Agent Dana Brooks with the State Attorney General's office. I'd advise you to stop speaking." Victoria froze. The room went silent. Brooks walked forward slowly, her credentials visible in her hand. "This office has been conducting a preliminary review of Cedarwood Estates HOA operations for the past several weeks, based on evidence submitted by multiple complainants. We've found sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation into allegations of document forgery, financial misappropriation, and breach of fiduciary duty." She stopped a few feet from Victoria. "You have the right to consult an attorney before answering any questions. I strongly suggest you exercise that right." Bethany Lee stood up, her voice shaking but clear. "I move for a vote of no confidence in Victoria Hale and the current board." Oliver seconded. The vote wasn't even close, 53 in favor, 12 opposed, the rest abstaining. Victoria watched the hands rise against her, and something in her face collapsed inward, the architecture of her certainty finally giving way. Richard Dane was already gathering his things, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Avery Lockridge had stepped back from the table, her professional distance now looking more like preparation for departure. I picked up the brass anchor and held it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight. My grandfather had carried this through decades of building something real. Tonight, I'd used it to tear down something false. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, wood-paneled and quiet, the kind of space where consequences became official. Victoria Hale stood before Judge Elwood Crane in a navy suit that looked like it had been chosen to project competence, but the woman wearing it had none left. 3 months had passed since the community meeting, 3 months of depositions and document reviews and plea negotiations that had stripped away every layer of the persona she'd constructed. Richard Dane had flipped within the first week, providing testimony in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The evidence he delivered, emails, financial records, recordings he'd kept as insurance, had made the case airtight. Victoria's attorney had advised her to accept the deal. She'd resisted until the end, convinced that somehow her connections would save her. They hadn't. Judge Crane read the charges with the measured cadence of a man who had seen this kind of fall before: forgery of business records, breach of fiduciary duty, filing false government documents. Victoria pleaded guilty to all 3 counts as part of the agreement. The sentence came down without drama: 18 months suspended, 3 years probation, $75,000 in restitution to the HOA, and a permanent ban from holding any position in a homeowners association or community organization. Victoria stood motionless as the words washed over her face a mask I couldn't read. When it was finished, she walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone, and I never saw her again. The aftermath reshaped Cedarwood Estates in ways I hadn't anticipated. Victoria's house went on the market within a month, sold to a young family who had no idea about its history and seemed genuinely delighted by the neighborhood. Richard Dane surrendered his law license and moved to another state, his reputation destroyed by his own insurance policy. Avery Lockridge's firm faced an ethics investigation that cost them several major clients, though no charges were filed. The HOA itself underwent a transformation that felt almost miraculous. Nora Griffin was elected president, Oliver Pratt became treasurer, and Bethany Lee took over as secretary, determined to spend her remaining years undoing the damage she'd helped enable. The new board rewrote the bylaws with transparency requirements that would have made Victoria's schemes impossible. Quarterly financial reports published to all residents, mandatory quorum verification for any vote, an independent audit every 2 years. The Community Enhancement Special Projects Fund was dissolved, and the recovered money was distributed proportionally to homeowners who had paid into it. The violations against my property were formally rescinded, and the kayak remained exactly where my grandfather had placed it. The marina hosted its first Cedarwood Community Day on a Saturday in early October, the kind of autumn afternoon where the light turns golden and the air carries just enough chill to remind you that nothing lasts forever. We'd opened the docks to residents' free kayak rentals, paddle boats for the kids, a barbecue station where Eli Turner held court with stories about the old days when my grandfather had built this place with borrowed money and borrowed time. I stood on the main pier and watched families spread across the waterfront, children running along the wooden planks, neighbors who had avoided each other for years now sharing tables and conversation. Emily found me there, her hand resting on the curve of her belly that had become impossible to hide. "Your grandfather would have loved this," she said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He would have. He'd built this marina so people could find peace, and for the first time in decades, that's exactly what was happening. Lily appeared beside me, her hair windblown, her face flushed with the particular joy of a child who has spent an afternoon on the water. "Dad, can we go on the Eleanor?" I looked at the old boat resting in slip number 1, her hull weathered, but solid, her name still legible, despite the years. "Yeah," I said. "I think it's time." We walked down the dock together, the 3 of us, and I helped Lily climb aboard the way my grandfather had helped me when I was her age. She settled into the captain's chair with the solemn importance of someone who understood she was sitting in a sacred space. "This was Great-Grandpa Samuel's boat," she said. I told her it was. "And he built the marina too." I said he had. She was quiet for a moment, her small hands resting on the wheel. "Is that why you fought so hard, because of him?" I sat down on the bench across from her, feeling the gentle sway of the boat beneath us. "Partly, but mostly I fought because it was the right thing to do. Your great-grandfather taught me that standing up for what's true matters more than staying comfortable." Lily nodded, absorbing this with the seriousness she brought to everything important. "Mom says the baby is going to be named Samuel." I smiled. "That's right." She considered this. "So the name keeps going, like the marina." I reached into my pocket and withdrew the brass anchor I'd been carrying for months. The weight of it had become so familiar that I'd almost forgotten it was there. "Lily, I want you to have this." She took it carefully, turning it over in her hands, feeling the cold metal and the worn edges. "What is it?" I told her the story how my grandfather had given it to me, what he'd said about staying anchored when you feel lost. Lily traced her finger along the anchor's edge, following the grooves worn smooth by decades of handling. "Did Great-Grandpa Samuel ever feel lost?" she asked. I thought about the stories Eli had told me how my grandfather had nearly lost everything in the recession of '73, how he'd sat on this very boat and considered selling the marina to pay his debts, how he'd decided instead to double down on the only thing he knew how to do, show up, work hard, and trust that integrity would outlast circumstance. "All the time," I said, "but he never let being lost stop him from moving forward. Lily considered this, then looked up at me with eyes that held more understanding than any 8-year-old should possess. That's what you did too, isn't it? You felt lost, but you kept going. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she held the anchor against her chest. I'll keep it safe, she said, and when I'm older, I'll give it to Samuel. Something cracked open in my chest. A grief and a joy so intertwined I couldn't separate them. The sun was setting by the time we walked back to the main dock, painting the lake in shades of orange and gold that made the water look like molten copper. Emily was waiting for us, with 2 cups of cider, and we stood together at the end of the pier, watching the light fade over a place my grandfather had loved, and I had learned to love again. Nora Griffin stopped by to thank me for opening the marina to residents. Oliver clapped me on the shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly right. Bethany Lee pressed my hand between both of hers and told me her late husband would have admired what I'd done. One by one, neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me came by to offer words I hadn't known I needed to hear, not because I'd won, but because I'd stayed. A year later, I would stand on this same dock with Emily beside me and our son Samuel in my arms. 3 months old and utterly unaware of the history surrounding him. Lily would be there too, the brass anchor now displayed in a small glass case in her bedroom, a talisman she'd already started showing to friends. The marina would still be operating, now with a community partnership program that offered discounted memberships to Cedarwood residents. A plaque would hang by the entrance. Cedar Marina, founded 1968 by Samuel J. Brewer, where peace finds home. But that evening in October, none of that had happened yet. There was only the sunset, the water, the family beside me, and the quiet certainty that some fights are worth having. Not because you're guaranteed to win, but because losing yourself is worse than losing anything else. Victoria Hale had knocked on my door, believing she held all the power. She'd been wrong. The power had never been in her clipboard, or her bylaws, or her carefully constructed threats. It had been in the truth, waiting patiently for someone willing to speak it. Victoria thought she could silence one man. She didn't realize she was waking up an entire community. If this story reminded you that standing up for truth matters, even when the odds look impossible, then you're exactly who belongs here. Subscribe to Karma Fence and hit the notification bell. Every week, we share stories of ordinary people who refuse to stay quiet. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever faced your own? Victoria, I want to hear your story.